Sitting here in this reconstruction of Ives's study brings me back to my first kind of indirect contact with him, although I never met him. But for a number of summers, I was going to a young people's summer camp in Ridgefield, Connecticut, which was just a few miles from West Reading. And the weird thing was that although I had a piano teacher in New York who was passionate about new music, she had never heard of Charles Ives. And I reflected on that many times to show that how in the 1950s, Ives was unknown even to those who would have had an interest if they could have found out about him. Since then, I've been extremely involved in the promulgation of Ives's music and working with performers to get them on his wavelength, which is not so easy, as I'll tell you a little bit later. The group of which I'm co-director, Continuum, gave its first Ives retrospective in the 1969-70 season, which was its third season, or fourth season, actually. So he was on our list right at the top of composers whom we felt we needed to give to the public in a complete concert that would give a large picture of his music. And those kinds of things worked because there were so many composers in those days, we're talking about the 60s, 70s, who were known by one or two pieces, but not really known for the greater reach of what they were doing. We continued working with it. We recorded his music in 1988. We did many performances of the quarter tone pieces for two pianos, which is a rather late work, an extraordinary piece, which we recorded on that first Musical Heritage Society CD. I have some interesting memories of performing the quarter tone pieces. The contrast, for example, of two performances we did, one in Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan, so Ives had reached Central Asia, and the other at MIT. As people who know that piece know, the trick is to get the right tuning of the two pianos that have to be tuned a quarter tone apart from one another. I won't leave it to the person listening to this interview to decide which of the two tunings was better. I will tell you it was the Tashkent tuning by far, which was one of the best tunings we've ever had by an Uzbek piano tuner. We arrived at MIT and I tried the two pianos and they weren't right. And the piano tuner said to me, "But I just checked them with Strobacon." I said, "They're not right." I said, "How do you know?" I said, "They're not right. Try it again." He tried it again and they were not right. The secret, of course, was very simple. I didn't actually tell him what I did. But if you have two pianos that are a quarter tone apart from one another, if you play C on one and C on the other and C sharp and C sharp, you should get an even quarter tone scale. It's the easiest thing in the world to figure out. Anyway, he hadn't figured it out, but the performance came out okay. I think the most remarkable performance I've ever heard of that piece was in the Ruhr Triennale, the huge new music and arts festival in the Ruhr Valley in West Germany, about 6 or 7 years ago, and they did a whole evening of Ives's music in an extraordinary location, which was a gigantic ex-gas factory, which I think made coal gas, which had been converted to an arts center. The orchestral music was done by the Bochum Symphony, conducted beautifully by Steve Sloan, the American conductor. But you couldn't find the orchestra because the place was so big, they hid it behind a partition until they all took a bow at the end. What was amazing, though, was the performance of the quarter tone pieces on two pianos that must have been at least 50 feet apart. So the stereo effect was unbelievable, and how they coordinated those, especially the slow movement, the scherzo, where there's very fast interchange between the two pianos, is totally beyond me. So that was some of my own personal experience until fairly recently, and I'll get back to that later. For years, I encouraged performances of Ives's music at Juilliard, and it's become much easier over the years with more of his music available and in good performances so that the students have some idea of the culture. Also, we make a point in the music history department of really stressing Ives's position in American culture. I realized vividly how essential that is in 2007 when I conducted a concert of the orchestra of the Shanghai Conservatory in Shanghai, and the main piece on the program was Ives' Third Symphony, which had never been done in China, as far as we know. They were fine. They got the point. They loved the piece. They played it really beautifully. It was a lot of fun. But after one rehearsal, two of the students came up to me and said, we're in the chamber music competition that's coming up soon. We wonder if we could get a coaching from you. And I said, absolutely fine. The first one I heard was a wind quintet playing Hindemith's Kleine Kammermusik, and they played it wonderfully. Any rumors that students in China can't play Western music are simply wrong. But the solution to how they managed to do it was very simple. Their coach was a bassoonist who had studied in Germany. So he really knew the German style, and he luckily knew the right style for Hindemith. And it came out wonderfully. The other group wanted me to coach them in the Ives piano trio. And that was a very different experience. They were all excellent players, and they had worked really hard, but they didn't get it because they didn't know anything about American culture. They didn't know anything about the tunes that play such a prominent role in that piece. And everything about it was extremely competent, but needed to be fixed. And so we worked very hard on it, and they were very good learners. I wasn't there for the competition, but my colleague at Juilliard, Bob McDonald, was. And I said, how was the Ives trio? He said they were fantastic. Unfortunately, the jury wasn't interested in Ives. But it just proved that people who come from very different cultures can figure out what to do with his music if they just have the opportunity to get a little guidance on it. I don't think of what I did as genius at all. It was simply showing them the road that they needed. I got to know Ives, well, I should go back to the festival in 2004. That was the 50th anniversary of Ives' death, and I decided to devote my January festival called Focus to Ives and his music, and mostly Ives himself. And there was an enormous number of performances. I must say the Juilliard students really walked up to the plate and struck a home run every time. It was quite amazing. The difficulty I had, and I never did get myself to do it, in some introductory remarks before the last concert, was to get myself to say, you should know that Ives heard almost none of this music performed in his lifetime, and probably none of it at all played well in his lifetime. It was such an emotional thing, I couldn't make myself say it, so I just kind of dropped it at that point. I got involved with Ives in a rather different way when I began working on my biography of Henry Cowell. It's nice to sit here in this room and see two of Cowell's publications of Ives' music. Cowell was Ives' first publisher, and in fact it all came about in a very peculiar way. As everybody who knows Ives knows, he had left the music business as a professional and become an insurance man, in which he became very prosperous and very prominent in the industry. In fact, I learned when I did that festival that some insurance companies downtown were still using his manual on training salesmen of insurance policies, which after so many years was really quite impressive. Anyway, there was a pianist who was one of the few people playing Henry Cowell's music. Her name was Margaret. I've forgotten what her birth name was. She was an American, but she was married to a very rich Serbian businessman, and they lived in New York. She had met him while studying in Vienna. And one day he said to her, we're having dinner tomorrow night with a business associate of mine called Charles Ives. And Margaret thought that was really interesting, although she didn't really know that he composed. And that subject came up, that he was a composer. And Margaret said, you know, my close friend, the Californian Henry Cowell, is not only a pianist and an amazing composer, but he's actually starting something called New-Music Quarterly, which he wants to be a publication on a subscription basis of just music, but music by composers that publishers won't touch. And I've said, well, tell him to send me his material, which Cowell did, and then they finally met, and Ives guaranteed to send him a check for $100, which I think is probably about $1,000 in today's currency, maybe more, every month, to underwrite the deficit of the company because he thought it was so important. And Cowell said, okay, but in exchange, I want to publish some of your music. And that was quite a statement, because another of his friends had said, well, Ives, is just an amateur. He's not that interesting, but they'd never seen his music. So these two pieces, these piano works by Ives, Cowell, and Ruggles, which was published a little bit later, and this one, and also the song editions, were Ives' first semi-commercial publication, and they really helped to get his name around. Ives also felt that it was really important to show the Europeans that something was going on in American music. Cowell, who had already toured extensively in Europe by 1929, including the Soviet Union, knew that Europeans and the Soviets, of course, were completely clueless about American composers. They thought American music was jazz. They didn't know anything else. So Cowell had been writing in newspapers there in Germany and in England and France and then in the Soviet Union about what was going on in American music. And Ives then thought, well, what we really need to do is put on a series of concerts in Europe of American orchestral music. And Ives would underwrite it. It would be organized by Cowell and some of his friends, including Ruth Crawford Seeger, who had already been living in Germany on the Fulbright. And then Cowell got a Fulbright and spent two 4 to 5 month periods in Berlin over 2 years studying non-Western music at the Prussian Academy. In Vienna, they wanted to get Webern to conduct the concert. Webern, as many people do not know, was an extraordinary conductor. Apart from his compositional activities, he was a really, really great musician. And so he agreed to get together with Cowell and talk about this proposed concert in Vienna and try to find out what kind of music was going to be there. And one of the pieces was going to be Three Places in New England, but another was going to be Cowell's Sinfonietta. And Webern said, well, let's go through your piece. And they spent a whole evening, according to Cowell, and Webern would say, well, why did you put that note here and not here? And Cowell would explain why. And then Webern was saying, why did you put that note here and not here? And Cowell would explain why. And at the end of the evening, Webern said, okay, I'm convinced you know what you're doing. I would not have written a piece like this, but you obviously are a real composer, and I'll do the concert. So Ives' Three Places in New England got conducted in Vienna by Webern. Other people did it in Paris and in Berlin and in Madrid. But generally the press reception was that Ives' piece was the most amazing of all of the pieces on this very unusual program. They immediately recognized that he was a real pro, even though he wasn't doing it professionally. This gets me, by the way, to a recollection, if I may contribute a recollection, of a conversation I had with Pierre Boulez in a festival that I put on at Juilliard celebrating the beginning of Elliott Carter's 100th year in 2008. Boulez was conducting the opening concert, I was conducting the second concert, and Jim Levine was conducting the final concert. In the opening concert, it was all Carter, but then I took Boulez out to dinner one evening. I didn't know him at all, but we had struck up a nice acquaintance. And I got on the subject of Three Places in New England in the big version that Jim Levine wanted to open his program with. And Boulez said to me, but Ives is such an amateur. And I said, well, I know you've said that, but I don't agree at all. And I think if you look at the third or second symphonies, to take two examples, you'll see he was an absolute master of harmony and counterpoint. He knew just what he was doing. Why do you say he was an amateur? And he said, well, at the beginning of that last movement of Three Places in New England, he writes really, really high for the strings and in really odd rhythms, and they can't play it together. And I said, well, I think that was the whole idea, because the whole image of that piece relates to a song called The Housatonic at Stockbridge, in which the text talks about the mist over the river at the source of the Housatonic, and then how the river gains strength as it flows south until it finally empties into the Long Island Sound. And I said this was very meaningful to Ives because he got engaged there. And I said, you know, I heard your amazing concert with the students at Lucerne a couple of years ago. And in that really loud concert hall, you got them to play really quietly. I think if you do that, you'll see it really works. And Boulez said, oh, I must try that. Now, I won't say the obscenity which that really represents in French. It ends with U, and the first word begins with F. But I happened to be sitting with Jim Levine, who's an old friend from our teen years, and told him this story. And when I mentioned my telling Boulez, if you try it quietly enough, you'll see it, Jim said, well, of course, anybody knows that. I guess everybody didn't know that at that point. My own performances of Ives' music have centered around the first piano sonata in recent years, which I decided to learn when I was 75. And it was well worth every note of it. I played it the first 3 times in New York, London, and Newcastle with a recently dislocated shoulder, which is not a way to play that piece that I would strongly recommend. But I managed to get through it. Then my shoulder got fixed and everything was fine. I played it again at the University of Birmingham as England was just beginning to lock down for the pandemic. We got a very good audience. They loved the piece. And I managed to get back to the United States just in the nick of time before everything shut. So then came the pandemic and one couldn't do much more. But I did have an engagement pending that didn't take place until May 28th, 2022. And that was at Oban. The drinkers who were watching this little chat will recognize the name Oban from single malt Scotch, for which it is famous. It's in northern Scotland. It's a very small town. And I had been invited to give a recital there. And I said, it was to be in 2020. I said, it's got to include the Ives First Sonata because I'm working on it very hard and I have no time to learn anything else major. And they agreed to do it, but then it got postponed. So I went up to do it on May 28th, 2022. And the audience in the small town was nice. It was about 50 people, almost all elderly women. I think women because they looked old enough so that the men had probably mostly passed on by that time. And almost no young people. The sponsors thought it was because there was a rock concert that night, but I knew better than that. Anyway, they had taken a chance on having the piece, but they felt they should be doing things like that. I think it was probably a very intelligent audience because there's a university there. At the beginning of the concert, I explained that they were going to hear some very dissonant music, and that dissonance is not discord. And in order to explain this, which was really vital for the Ives Sonata, but also for the other pieces I was playing by Copland, Ruth Seeger, and Henry Cowell, I said I will just quote an Indonesian composer who's a friend of mine who's asked why he always writes such dissonant music. And he said, I love Indonesian food because it is so spicy. I like my music spicy too. And it went over beautifully with them. They figured, oh yes, that's what it's about. It's about spice. It's not about anger and discord. At the end of the program, most of the audience came individually up to me or to the members of the music committee to say, thank you for letting us hear music finally we not only have never heard, but we've never heard of. And it seemed to transform their lives, which I thought was really what we're always after. Another interesting Ives performance experience was at Bryant Park in Midtown Manhattan during the year in which my concert season at the Museum of Modern Art had to be moved because of construction of the first extension. This would have been around 2001. I had programmed on one concert, all Juilliard students, a fantastic violinist named Vesko Gelev, who's from Bulgaria, and I've forgotten who the pianist was, but an excellent pianist. And I happened to be sitting next to the New York Times critic. I'd never met her, so I didn't recognize her. It was Anne Midgett. And at the beginning of that summer, one of the Times critics had written a rather nasty piece about why would MoMA do these concerts in a place like Bryant Park where there's so many street people and it's not the right audience and, blah, 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 blah. And at the end of the first movement, someone who looked clearly homeless man stood up and started applauding wildly, obviously never having been taught we don't applaud between movements. And Anne turned to me and said, he gets it, look at that. And she wrote this beautiful piece about how this is where you should be playing this music because people like him will never come into the MoMA garden, even though it's free, because they'll feel embarrassed, but this is their home. So, about the sonata and the Concord Sonata that I'm learning right now, I think there are a couple of problems that any pianist who learns them have to solve, and one of them is the density of the writing. The theory that I developed about the first sonata, which may not be agreed upon by all, is that Ives was still thinking as an organist, that he was adding dissonant intervals on the top to change the color of what he really wanted to hear. In other words, it wasn't the top that you should be playing, but middle voices that were really beautiful and really interesting. And I think it really solved for me the whole problem of how to make the dramaturgy of that sonata come across, to really constantly think of him as an organist. And it becomes especially crucial in the beginning of the fourth movement, where he has mammoth leaps between the bass and the treble that would actually be quite easy on a multi-keyboard organ and are almost impossible and not good for the shoulder by the way, on a piano. I decided, in honor of my having retired from Juilliard, that at age 82 it was time to learn the Concord Sonata. And actually, strangely enough, the problems are somewhat smaller there, which I would not have believed, because the writing is somewhat more transparent than it is in the first sonata, which is still a kind of romantic piece. So that's been great fun to learn. I checked in about some errors I found, and nobody had any definitive information. And so my parting word is, when you play a piece like this, you do what you believe in and trust that Ives won't telephone you. Thanks.